Listen, there ain't nothing like living right on the edge of the Great Dismal Swamp over here in Camden County, Virginia. All sorts of strange sounds, sights, and what have you. My family and I have experienced a handful of spooky, unexplainable things that don't make sense. This has been going on since I was just a little kid. My daddy and I have seen beasts of the swamp come right up to our house and press their faces against the back window. Sometimes it's just one of them. Sometimes it's several of them. And they would case the house, looking for spots to try and pry the doors open to get in. These creatures are dangerous. They look sort of like wolves. The faces are dark in color. These things walk on their hind legs, just like a person, and not a dog. They have short snouts and very human facial features, high jawbones, human-like facial structures, and sunken-in eyes that are very striking. The eyes, they have this unnatural orange glow to them, like something out of a horror movie. It's always scared us to death when these things show up. You can feel it. The first time I had an encounter was when I was a 10-year-old little girl, and I was lying in my bed, drifting off to sleep, or almost, when all of a sudden, my room got really dark. I had my blinds and curtains completely open, and my head was against the wall, right underneath my window. Something really big stood in front of my window to block the light coming through, and in that moment as a kid, I turned around, half curious and half scared, and saw the horror that stood on the other side of my window. It just stood there and watched me, and gave me a small smirk, and looked away. I was terrified. Those aren't the only other critters we got out here either, because my daddy has seen what he called lizard men emerging out of the swamp waters nearby at night. Sometimes they're drawn toward the porch light at night, so we make sure to keep all outside lights off if we absolutely can. He don't like to take any chances. One time, one of these things walked right up to our car in our carport and hid in the dark. You can hear it making this clicking noise, and you could see the glowing eyes that it had. My daddy fired his gun, and it still didn't even move. Anything that isn't afraid of a gun is something to be feared. When I say the swamp is dangerous, I mean it. Animals that are not supposed to exist thrive out there, and when they don't have to worry about being found, they can just torment those who live near the home without ever worrying. I wanted to mention this before I ended the email. Sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes, we'll find random dead animals all around outside the house. They look to be like they've just dropped dead mid-step. It's so weird. Animals that aren't even really common around here either. We found a dead coyote once by our carport that looked like it had just fallen over and died. No signs of any poison, struggle, nothing. We found a boxer dead too. A few cats, raccoons, all died the same way. My daddy thought they were getting into poison somewhere, but no one around here, nor any of us, lay out poison that these things can get into. More answers than questions at this point. The worst is during the spring and fall, where at night, you can hear all sorts of awful noise. The swamp will get really quiet, and you'll start to hear either these loud dinosaur roars and screams. It sounds like something out of a movie, and it sounds big. Then other times, you'll hear this deep roar that sounds like it's coming from a huge wolf. No doubt it's the swamp creatures that paid me a visit when I was a little girl. The sounds are incredibly loud at night. Other neighbors swear they heard a car being smashed into a tree. Other neighbors claim they will sometimes hear things in their backyards and driveways. I know the folks around here are very cautious and even have spotlights all around to ward these things away. From our experience, the swamp creatures are drawn to the light, and we're not sure why. The swamp creatures are very intelligent and know how to find food without anybody noticing. Maybe this is why they come toward the light. Sorry for so many things that don't make sense. We are trying to make sense of it ourselves. All we know is we have a swamp full of critters, like lizard men, and giant dogs that walk on their hind legs. We don't know what to do. I believe my friends and I had an encounter with a werewolf, or some sort of werewolf entity. For the record, I'm a 17-year-old kid, and because of COVID, a lot of my friends and I were left with nothing to do. We are avid watchers of ghost hunters and paranormal investigations, and decided it would be a good idea to do our own EVP session out in one of our oldest cemeteries in town. So, we waited one night till around midnight, where the four of us can sneak out and go. We get there about midnight, and the cemetery has graves that date back to the early 1800s. It's not very large, but it holds about 70 graves, if I had to take a wild guess. There's a lot of trees and coverage, especially now that spring has come and everything is grown in. The cemetery has your typical black spiral fencing around, but beyond that is heavy trees and forest, so you can't just walk by on the street and look in. It might even be privately owned, so technically, we were actually probably breaking and entering. Oh well. There's a couple of mausoleums on the far side that I believe were owned by some of the original families here. We found a large gravestone that was sitting by this large dead tree, and thought it would be the perfect place and time to sit down and do our session. We began our EVP session, asking some simple questions. Being summertime, everything around us was quiet, but I've never been to a graveyard at night, so I was already on edge. In my head, I was thinking crickets should be making noise, but they weren't. My friend kept saying that he felt the energy change around us, and we were invoking the wrong spirits. I thought he was just pulling my chain, because I had not felt a thing, and I'm sitting right next to him. Then, we heard a noise, maybe 50 feet away, behind a couple of the other graves that sounded like rustling, and leaves crunching. At this point, my friend is freaking out, and thinking demons are going to come and take us. Oh, I should also mention that we only have our phone flashlights for whatever reason. Why we decided not to grab our flashlights at home, I don't know. Maybe we were far too excited. It was a heavily cloud-covered night, lots of overcast, so there was no light from the moon. We continued our session and asked a few more questions with my friend while he is shaking. He interrupts me mid-question, says he thinks there's something over there watching us and points. I said, "You're just paranoid." So I shined the flashlight over there, and all of us at the same time, we see these tiny red orbs and these tall pointed ears coming from out behind a really large family tombstone about 40 feet away. My friend jolts suddenly, saying, "What is that thing? Is that a demon?" I kept my ground and stood still, and I whispered in his ear, "Let's get out of here," really slowly. Whereas my other two friends were huddled right behind me. We all stood up slowly and backed away to the far side of the cemetery, where this thing continued to watch us and not move from beyond the gravestone. Due to its location, we were actually backing up away from the entrance, and we needed to find a way to kind of slyly get around. So we hid behind a couple of tombstones, and each of us took turns making a beeline for the entrance. We did this one at a time, without this thing ever seeing us, or so we like to think. That's the only and last time I'm ever doing an EVP session in a graveyard, and it's kinda killed my desire to do any ghost hunting or paranormal investigation. Since we saw the tops of its ears and its eyes, it looked like your typical werewolf. My friend, the one who was freaked, is convinced we summoned a demon and refuses to talk about it. But honestly, I don't exactly know what happened. I believe we saw something, and potentially a werewolf spirit, or maybe a werewolf, even though I can't exactly say that's what it was. I haven't told my parents or any of my other friends about what happened, so I'm desperately looking online for answers and people I can talk to about it. We were actually planning on bringing out a Ouija board out there, but with the way the events transpired, boy, I'm glad we didn't. Who knows what else would have happened? Part of me wonders if us trying to do an EVP session called this thing in, or if it just happened to be lingering around nearby and saw us and took its chance to watch us and be curious. I've looked online a little bit, and I have seen some similarities between people seeing werewolves in graveyards, but it seems to be mainly Indian burial grounds as the common denominator. I don't know my geography terribly great, but I'm pretty sure there aren't any native reservations or anything around here, so that's checked off the list. Had we not spotted it, who knows if it was truly trying to creep closer and maybe grab one of us. I don't feel like it had the best intentions considering it was hiding and trying to stay incognito. At the same time though, it did reveal half its face and upper head to watch us from afar. I felt it was more curious, but my feelings could very well be wrong. After all, I felt that nothing would happen, so I was wrong there. Maybe it was waiting for the right time to grab one of us, like I said. I'm just glad we didn't stick around to find out. Somehow, when we made our exit out of the graveyard, hugging the outer perimeter wall, we didn't see it anymore, which was equally frightening. I don't know where it went. Maybe it was there guarding someone's grave. Maybe it was someone's pet. I don't know. People say there's a certain kind of energy that lingers around old graveyards, but whether that's true or false, I can't exactly say. I didn't initially feel anything different about the atmosphere around us when we first entered, nor did I really when we left. I was just seeing this creature. I never felt a sensation of anything wrong per se. Anyway, I'm not here to turn this into a novella. I just have no desire to ever return to a graveyard to do any sort of EVP session at nighttime again. I would have gone during the day, and it might have been a different scenario. I'll never know now, because I am staying far away. Thanks for reading. I was busy doing dishes late one night when I happened to glance out my window right above my kitchen sink. I had to adjust my eyes and squint at first because I wasn't exactly sure what I was seeing. Once I was able to make out what it was, the sight before me was truly terrifying and frightening. I thought it was a man at first, except he looked like a dog, had a long snout and pointed ears. They reminded me of a German Shepherd's ears, and I had a hard time understanding what I was looking at. But then, my eyes continued to observe the rest of its body. It had a torso like a man, with human-looking arms and legs. This thing was covered in hair or fur all over its body, and it appeared to be a dark brown or black color. It was one leg stepping over our old wooden fence with what appeared to be a dead cat in its arm. As soon as it lifted its leg over the fence, it quickly turned its head back toward the direction it was coming from, as if to make sure it wasn't being seen. I got goosebumps, bad. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. As soon as it lifted its leg over the fence, it quickly lifted up the other leg and was gone in a flash. I threw the dishes down and ran to go wake up my wife to let her know what I had seen. She said to me in a groggy state that I shouldn't stay up late anymore and do dishes because clearly I was seeing things. I still don't quite understand what it is that I saw, even though my wife doesn't believe me. I've looked on Google to see if I can find any images close to what I saw, and I guess it's a rougarou. I believe that is French for werewolf, although I'm pretty sure that werewolves are fictional. But I can't deny what I saw that night, so I really don't know what it was. It was so scary and so human-like. The only dog-like thing about it was that it was covered in fur and that it had a large head of a dog. I'm convinced that I saw a wolfman of some kind. I'm just thankful that it never turned back and looked at me. If it wasn't for the full moon shining at the right place during the right time, and having virtually no clouds, and having not looked up when I did, I would have never ever known it was there. It was maybe only 30 to 40 feet away from the window. I used to live in a neighborhood in eastern Pennsylvania for about 12 and a half years. Pennsylvania is the witchcraft capital of the world, so all sorts of freaky stuff goes on. For the record, this neighborhood was a little bit smaller. We all kind of knew each other. I lived in that neighborhood on and off for 12 years, but we had what we'd like to call the neighborhood creeper. We all kept tabs on what this thing was, but we believe it was some sort of monster. Look, I know that sounds silly coming right off the bat, but let me explain. This creature would steal our cats and dogs, and it tried to break into our houses. Only sometimes, though. It wasn't around all the time, and there never seemed to be a rhyme or reason for it showing up. But it was primarily active during the early morning hours and at nighttime. It would come and go, no matter what season or month. Unfortunately, I got the chance to see this thing nearly face to face through my window. It had a very scary wolf-like face, pointed ears, and very human-like hands, but they were pressed up against the glass, so I couldn't see them as much as I would want to, or not want to. Judging by the size of this animal, it could have very easily just pushed my window through and gotten to me, but it didn't. It was like it was reminding me that I was its prey, and it wanted to keep me in my cage until it was ready to feast. I know deep down that this thing could catch me and put me out of my house and eat me if it wanted to. There is a very old sweet lady that lived just a few houses down from me. God rest her soul. She passed away a few years before I moved out, but she described it as looking like a werewolf. She said it was black and gray in color and had very large teeth. She said it would always steal her cats and eat them. She was one of those elderly ladies that kind of let it go with having cats. I mean, her cats were always having kittens and having more and more kittens. She never really took care of them, and it really got out of hand. I guess you can say she was the crazy old cat lady, but she wasn't a crazy lady, she was actually a very sweet, loving lady. Anyway, maybe that's one of the reasons why this thing came around. There was free food supply. I'm not exactly sure. Most people in the neighborhood were terrified from what I recall, and nobody tried shooting at it or calling the cops because, come on, what are they going to do? Last I heard when I moved out, there was still activity because I still keep in contact with some of my neighbors. I had developed close relationships with some of them, especially the ones close to me, and to my knowledge, this thing still lurks around the neighborhood from time to time. To answer some of your questions, to my knowledge, it has never broken into anybody's house, although it has attempted. It's never attacked or hurt anybody, other than household pets, but it has scared the pants off many. The neighborhood kind of goes down on an unofficial lockdown at night, and really don't see anybody out after dark. It's strange because you can go a few neighborhoods over, and people are out walking their dogs at night. But in the evening, not in this neighborhood. I'm glad to have been gone, and honestly, I have no desire to ever return. I was up in the Pacific Northwest and hunting during doe season. I had my tree stand all set up, and I got up there early as I could, waiting for deer. Luckily for me, I was on a friend's property, in which he owned about 30 plus acres. I much preferred hunting on private property, so I didn't have to try and compete with a kill. What happened to me this day made me take a hiatus from deer hunting. So I'm sitting there, waiting in the stand, and I hear something big coming at me in the woods. My first instinct was that it was maybe a large buck, just because of the large sounds and how fast it was traveling. I looked off in the distance where the noise was coming from, and just out of the trees came this massive wolf-looking creature on all fours that just seemed to be passing by. It walked off up into this small hill and vanished again in the trees. I was speechless. I didn't know creatures like that existed out here in the woods of Oregon, and decided it was time to hang things up for a while. Not my story, but a friend's information that I am sharing. I grew up and lived in Colorado for a long time before moving out of state. I have several close friends that are Arapaho, and have a lot of stories about encounters with creatures they dealt with years back. Not they specifically, stories passed down from their tribe. I don't know if there are any other major native tribes other than the Arapaho that primarily lived in the Colorado region, but it's the only ones I'm aware of. Many probably know that the Rocky Mountains hold a lot of mysteries. Some of the stories that were shared with me was information dating back to the early 19 and 1800s. Fur trappers and tribesmen alike were captured and devoured alive by these werewolf creatures. I can't remember what the Arapaho called them, but they had a name for these things. Trying not to convolute the situation, these same werewolf-like creatures would wage war with these other beings that we know called Bigfoot. The Arapaho also had a name for them, but I can't remember that either. These werewolf creatures would storm into the villages at night, steal children and smaller little kids. They were stealing these little children to eat. They would send the tribe warriors out to go hunt these creatures down, and when the tribesmen would find them, or what was left of them, it was just bones, far, far away in the nest of those creatures. Many tribesmen and fur trappers alike died at the hands of these beings. Bow and arrows and muzzleloaders were no match for a 9-foot-tall beast of the night with superhuman strength. Going back to the werewolf creature waging war with Bigfoot-like creatures, it was believed by my friend's tribe that they were waging war over who got to eat and prey upon the tribe. Many of the tribe's fiercest warriors at the time witnessed the battles between these two creatures, and oftentimes would result in either both creatures dying or leaving the battle severely injured. The creatures, not the warriors. My friend told me that his tribe describes these creatures as much taller and larger than some of their greatest warriors, and gray to dark gray in color. The Bigfoot-like beings of the tribe were talked about were also very hostile, and would come to capture and steal their women and children at night as well. It was a dangerous environment, and a constant territorial war between the Arapaho, Bigfoot, and Dogman. There are different sectors of the Arapaho tribe, and one particular tribe, or village, moved around in fear that these creatures would keep stalking them. It became a relentless pursuit, until the village was successful in killing a small handful of these werewolf creatures, severing their heads and putting them on spears, placing them all outside the village to ward off other dangers. Their claim was that these creatures lived in this large underground den deep in the mountainside that they would drag the captured children, women, and tribesmen to and eat them. From what I was told, this den was never expunged because they couldn't match the firepower of these creatures, only ward them off from their own territory, which means that this den is probably alive and well today, and is still very active from the sounds of all the other Dogman encounters in the state. I'm sure it is one of the many dens. Just the thought of that sends shivers down my spine. There's a couple times that tribesmen had ventured into this same den when there were no other Dogman in it, mainly during the day, and would find tons upon tons of human bones and skulls. I thought you might find these stories interesting. Feel free to share them with your audience if you would like to. One night, I got up from sleep and was leaving my bedroom to go get some water downstairs. I saw something behind the curtains in my living room that looked big and black. I could see the shape, and it resembled a strange werewolf silhouette standing close by the door, when suddenly, it turned onto its hands on all fours and ran off towards my neighbor's house in the opposite direction. I was scared out of my mind just seeing this tall thing right outside my house. My curtains are so thin, and the moon cast a perfect silhouette of this thing. I wanted to scream my lungs out. My neighbor is a strange guy who has been a paranormal researcher for years. I have never taken him seriously, but maybe I should. Although, I don't think he will ever believe me if I told him a werewolf charged at his house. But there is no denying this creature really exists, and it scared the hell out of me. The next day, while I was walking around the neighborhood, I saw strange shadows lurking around during my night walk. Gave me the creeps, so I came home early. I couldn't help but shake the feeling that these things are real. After I went back home, I kept thinking about it more and more, and finally said to myself, Did I see a werewolf last night? And I went online to research it. There is a whole community of people online who share the same beliefs of having an actual werewolf sighting, which surprised me. A lot of people that claim they saw them, with having near accurate descriptions as to what I saw that night. Now, there are so many places online where people like to talk about their encounters. Vic Cundev's forum, website. I know about the North American Dogman project. Your channel. There's so many. There's just something about watching a Dogman encounter on YouTube now that feels so validating. I feel like I'm not crazy. I know I may be older and getting gray, but I'm not insane. These things are real. So, along with the Skinwalker stories and experiences that I've shared with you in the past, I've actually had a couple of stories with Dogman that I would like to personally share with you. Before I get into them, I want you to know that I've wanted to make sure I've done a little bit of research beforehand, so I can give you the most accurate details. I believe firsthand that there are actually different variants of these creatures. I was being hunted by a pack of them in the outback of Montana that closely resembled the werewolves from the movie Underworld, but not quite 100%. That was the only Hollywood image that they resembled closest. The second time I had a Dogman encounter, it was on the East Coast in Virginia, and that Dogman resembled very closely to that of the werewolf you see at the very end of the Van Helsing movie. Very scary looking, lots of teeth, and a large bodybuilder type of body. You know, kind of like a furry black Arnold Schwarzenegger. These creatures are more intelligent than we give them credit for. It's scary. It really is. I believe they are intelligently designed to be a highly advanced killing machine. I've seen the way these creatures move together, work together, an intelligent pack mentality. They plan, strategize, and work towards a common goal. They are not to be underestimated. I've seen them deal some serious damage. Now, the first time I've ever had a real experience with these creatures was when I received a phone call from a gentleman whose name I will keep hidden in Montana. This man ran a rather large cattle farm who needed some help. He had explained to me that some of the things he was experiencing with his cattle disappearing, and different means of finding them dead. It got my attention, to say the least. At the time, I thought it to be a possible Bigfoot situation, and grew very excited about it. In that moment, I only knew very little about Dogman. So I flew out there and decided to spend some time with this guy. His situation was far worse than I had imagined. Owning around 200 cattle, and at the time, more than 40 of them had been picked off, eaten, and torn in pieces. Finding different cadavers every day, in various stages of decay, and ways they were killed. Some were clearly eaten on, while others had their throats torn from their bodies, and others were missing limbs and major body parts. He suspected that this was the work of a clan of Bigfoots, after previously dealing with an aggressive clan of Bigfoots when he was much younger. He already knew what they were capable of. This is where I came into the picture. Using some special techniques, like night vision, we were able to determine very quickly that it was no Bigfoot problem. This was a Dogman problem, and a pack of them. There looked to be about 7 or 8 of them, with one really large alpha male. During the evening, they would scout the outer perimeter of this man's land, picking off cattle that wandered too close, or in this case, too far. Sometimes killing them on the spot, other times grabbing the cattle whole and then taking them off into the forest. The man that I was helping wasn't stupid. He knew that he was clearly outmatched and knew firepower alone was going to stop these things. He told me if they didn't stop a Bigfoot, they weren't going to stop these things. These are far more aggressive. When you're dealing with a pack of these things, you have to be very careful about your approach. One wrong move, and these beings could take your life. Even though this was my first time dealing with these in the physical realm, I had spent much of my time researching about these beings prior. Even though I knew very little, like I said, I still had a pretty good general idea. As the nights grew on, they continued to get braver, venturing further onto this man's land and taking more cattle with them. We got better looks at them. closely observed their behavior and how they would kill. These creatures were so smart, so strategic in their killing. FYI, we watched much of this take place through his night vision binoculars at a safe distance. Sometimes one of these creatures would tear a cow apart in half. Other times they would circle a few of them and close in on one of them. It was total bloodshed. I'll never forget when the alpha male, the one clearly larger than the rest of the pack and had what appeared to be gray running down its chest, would just grab small calves by their back legs, throw the calves up over his shoulder, and walk off with them, like they were some fresh kill, a rabbit kill. They were still alive and screaming. It was a horrifying sight, and this man had to just sit there and watch as his cattle were being taken down one by one. The following afternoon, just before dark, I decided to try and set up trail cams on the far side of the land, the area in which they came from every evening. I decided to go out a little further than the edge of his land so I could get a better and more accurate capture. I probably went about a half mile into this densely packed forest and started setting up some cams. It wasn't long before I could feel the distinct feeling of being watched. It was like I was an insect being observed by a human, right before getting stepped on and squished. I maintained my composure and kept setting up the cams. I could feel the air changing around me. I knew deep down in my gut that I now was the one being hunted. I began to hear the brush and trees move around from all directions. They were circling in on me and moving in. I pressed back the way I came, very cautiously, trying my hardest not to run, because that would have invoked a chase. They stayed close by the entire time of my retreat, just beyond my visibility behind the trees. They didn't follow once I made it out to the open. That night, we watched closely, and we heard these terrible screams and noises from the area that they came from. They were so loud and terrifying, it turned the man I was working with white as a sheet. It made him physically ill, nauseous, as if seeing these things through binoculars wasn't terrifying enough. Now, we were hearing their ferocity, for real. They never appeared that night to claim more cattle. So, we waited a couple more days before going back into that portion of the forest to retrieve my cams, only to find that they were gone. No trace of any of them. I set up 6 cams, all of them nowhere to be found, no traces left. They must have known what I was doing and been intelligent enough to sabotage any potential evidence that I could have gotten of them. I can't understate their high human-like intellect. Just like dust clearing and settling, they seemed to vanish after that. Even when I had stepped in the late afternoon, only a couple of days later to retrieve my cams, there was no trace of them. The forest was alive and full of noise, unlike how it was upon my first entry to put up the cams the days before. There was no ill feelings, nothing. Lots of cattle bones and skulls though, and old cadavers. We kept watching the following nights, and nothing. Activity seemed to die. I stayed for another 3 or 4 nights, and activity continued to die off. The gentleman I was with, who by the way again has wished to remain anonymous for any future storytelling of this account, contemplated selling his land and all of his cattle. He had lost a total of 72 cattle to these creatures. Whether he did or not, I'm unsure of. We kept in touch, and I left to go back to my home state. To this day, he actually ended up keeping the land and the cattle, and he has had 0 problems and has slowly recouped his lost cattle. I'm unsure of why they left or what pulled them away. The man had been there for years, and the problem had only been up until very recently during the time. My strongest hypothesis is that they were passing through the area, saw there was lots of free food, and acted on it. They at one point realized that they were being tracked and decided to move to a different area. That's my at least best understanding of the situation. Now, on to the second time that I had to deal with these things. This time was much scarier in my opinion, because this creature had cornered me, and I believe if it wasn't for my friend burning plastic and trash, it would have claimed my life. I'm sure of that. At the time, I wasn't doing any real cryptozoology research, since I would take frequent breaks from research just to live my life and not obsess over it like some friends would. As much as I enjoyed it, it sometimes is putting yourself out there in the wild with the purpose of being vulnerable just so you could potentially capture a cryptid on camera. It's not all that worth it. At least that's how I felt. Sometimes you don't even have to do that for creatures to expose themselves to you. I learned this that time. I was far outside Asheville, North Carolina, visiting a close friend of mine for a 3-day travel stop. We never discussed anything strange, cryptids, paranormal, nothing. This friend wasn't a believer in any of that stuff. Things were very ordinary, as boring as that is to say. On the second day, I was helping him restore parts of this old, large barn-like shed that he had on the far side of his back property. Yeah, you already know where this is going. Maybe I should have been smart enough before I offered to help that this could happen. Optimism didn't work out for me that day. Since he had recently broken his leg, he needed help, and being a good friend, I wanted to help the man out. There were some backboards of the shed that needed to be replaced, and fortunately, he had the lumber to use. I got back there and started tearing out the old boards on the back side of the shed. To my right, about 20 feet, is thick woods. Behind me, about the same length, is the same woods. And then to my left, the yard goes on for a while, all clear open grass. Then in front of me directly was the backside to the shed. I had my back turned to the woods, and I guess this is where I made my biggest mistake. I left myself open and vulnerable. My friend was on his front lawn, doing whatever he could with a broken leg to try and get stuff cleaned up, hobbling around. Even though I advised him strongly to take it easy, he was far too stubborn to do so. Like clockwork, I don't even think I was back there for maybe 10 minutes before those good old feelings of dread started to wash over me. In the moment, I don't think I thought much about it, though, and just brushed it off, tearing these old boards off. That's when I heard something heavy walking my direction from the woods directly behind me. I turned to see, and approaching me was this monstrosity of a being before me, slowly taking a step towards me, and then pausing, and then another step, and then pausing. This creature maintained the most intense look on its face, challenging me, staring me down, and sizing me up. All I could do was put my back against the shed in total fear as this thing approached me. I knew if I ran, I would be a dead man. I would be done for. And just like the movie I described, this thing was jet black, had a long muzzle full of sharp teeth that overlaid out of its jaw. Its stature was very wide, built with rippling muscles and long 4-inch black claws on each of its 5 fingers. Just like a wolf does, it had that distinct fluffy mane hair on the side of its face and neck. Unlike the other pack of creatures I saw in Montana that looked much more humanoid, this thing just looked like a werewolf on steroids. It towered over me, even from 20 feet away. It was like Goliath from the Bible had been a werewolf. Even though many others describe these beings with red eyes, yellow eyes, etc., this creature had eyes very similar to that of a wolf. Yellow, but with black pupils, and even had whites in its eyes. Very human-like eyes. Its face just had this very fierce expression. It crept towards me until it had fully stepped out into the grass in view. For the first time in my life, I saw this thing in complete form, full daylight and all. Even though I was on the verge of having a heart attack just from fear alone, you can't deny the magnificence of this being. Morbid, I know, but when you're around a beast this size and stature, it changes you. Before it took another step towards me, it stopped, looked over to my left, and began sniffing the air around it, just like a dog does when they smell something. It lifted its head up in the air, smelling. Then its ears immediately went back, and a scowl came across its face. Then, it turned to look at me in the eyes, gave a low grunt in dissatisfaction, turned around and walked off back into the woods where it just came from. After it disappeared from sight, the sounds around me came back, and I was left there, lying against the back of the shed, nearly about to crap myself, having come that close with death. I said screw this shed and ran back to the front of the house to freak out on my friend and let him know what's in his backyard. Before I even got to the front of his yard, I saw some black smoke bellowing. I came around the side of his house, and the man has a large burn pit where he is burning all sorts of trash, plastic, food, you name it. The smell was atrocious, and now I know exactly what that creature smelt. I waved my arms and yelled to him, and he comes over to me. In a moment of hesitation, I had a change of heart. Maybe I shouldn't tell him. Besides, if the poor guy really knew, he has a broken leg. What's he gonna do? Be defenseless and hobble around? I just said that the shed has more problems, and it's going to need more than just wood. He looked at me confused, and even though I probably should have told him, I just didn't think he would have believed me. I told him I wasn't feeling very well, and I needed to leave early. He understood. I know this sounds crappy, but I was still in total shock, and wanted to create as much distance as I could from what happened. I think I just stayed in a hotel that night, until I left the state the following day. I couldn't stop thinking about the creature, and the fact that it was halted by the smell of burning trash and plastic. I never would have guessed. I have come to terms with it since researching, now that it was just another variant of these creatures. Hopefully I'll have more stories to share with you in the future.